Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Dominic Canonico, and I'm an undergraduate Soren Fellow with the Center for Ethics and Culture. And on behalf of the Center, I'd like to welcome you all to the third and final installment of the 2014 Catholic Literature Series. Every fall since 2002, the Center for Ethics and Culture has sponsored the Catholic Literature Series, a series of lectures focused on prominent figures in the Catholic literary tradition. Through these lectures, the Center hopes to expose the Notre Dame community to the richness and depth of the Catholic literary heritage. The focus of this year's lectures is William Shakespeare, in honor of the 450th anniversary of his birth. While the questions of whether or not Shakespeare himself was Catholic remains largely unsettled, the Center hopes to explore many of the resonant religious themes that run throughout his works. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to remind you that this lecture and our two previous lectures in the series will soon be made available on the Center's website, where you can also view lectures from previous years. I'd also like to draw your attention to a sign-up sheet that will be in the back of the room for anyone who is interested in being added to the Center's mailing list. Tonight we have with us Professor Robert Miola. Professor Miola is the Gerard Manley Hopkins Professor of English at Loyola University, Maryland, and he received his PhD in English from the University of Rochester. His research interests include Shakespeare, Renaissance drama and poetry, and the classical backgrounds of English literature. He is the author of a number of works on Shakespeare, such as Shakespeare's Reading, Shakespeare's Rome, and Shakespeare and Classical Tragedy, and he has edited several editions of Shakespeare's plays, including the Norton Critical editions for Hamlet and Macbeth. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Robert Miola.
Well, people all the time say they're glad to be here, but I really am glad to be here at this great university, home of some dear friends, and recently met, but no less dear, students. I learned quite a bit about the university and other matters at dinner. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about Cymbeline and some other plays of Shakespeare, so if you haven't read Cymbeline, it's okay. There's some more familiar names in here. And one student courageously and quite rightly asked me at dinner, what does wrying mean? It means erring. Okay, so as I hope will be clear. Perhaps the most, and by the way, that's the four headings of the talk in case you're required to come and have to take notes. Just make it easy for you. Perhaps the most surprising moment in Cymbeline, a play composed of unpredictable plot turns, occurs at the outset of 5:1. Posthumous enters with a bloody cloth. He has proof, this is, he thinks, that his faithful servant Pisanio, at his command, has killed his unfaithful wife, so he thinks, Imogen. Yea, bloody cloth, I'll keep thee, for I wished thou shouldst be colored thus. You married ones, if each of you should take this course, how many must murder wives much better than themselves for wrying but a little? Nothing Posthumous has said or done to this point prepares us for this emotional and ethical volte-face, this moment of sudden repentance and forgiveness, quote, the single most important change Shakespeare made to the wager plot, unquote, Martin Butler. The turnabout raises searching questions about the nature of marriage, the moral obligations of spouses, the imperatives of revenge and of forgiveness. Up to this point, Posthumous has affirmed very conventional gender roles and values, endorsing male dominance and violence, and idealizing female chastity and fidelity. And we have the whole wager plot, Posthumous swearing his ladies the most virtuous in the world, and the villainous Iachimo taking him up and deciding to prove that he can seduce this paragon of virtue. Female fidelity is a public commodity to be bragged about, tested, owned, and defended with weapons. When Iachimo reports his success, Posthumous vents the cuckold's traditional anguish and rage. Is there no way for men to be, but women must be half workers? We are all bastards. And that most venerable man which I did call my father was I know not where when I was stabbed. And then it moves on. Oh, vengeance, vengeance. The misogyny is entirely conventional, very bitterly expressed here, at least as old as Greek tragedy. You may remember Euripides' Hippolytus also lamenting the divine plan that involved women in human procreation. Os deu tide kibdelon anthropois kakon gunaikos es phos helio katoikisas, and so on. And then those final two lines, if you wish to propagate the human race, there must be a better way. And this is Milton, of course. You may remember in Paradise Lost, why God created, Adam asks why God created women, this fair defect, and why he did not find some other way to generate mankind. So these are the deep traditions of misogyny, anti-feminism, and so on. Women are the sum of all faults. And you may think of some other speeches in Shakespeare that echo some of this misogynic tirade. You may remember frailty, thy name is woman. And these are all men who believe in some way their, in this case, mother, in other cases, wives, have been perfidious and who have betrayed them. You may think of this fellow, Othello, who plays out the imperative to revenge, of course. And you may think of Claudio in Much Ado, who believes Hero is unfaithful. And of course, a very striking picture of a young Judi Dench there in The Winter's Tale, Leontes and Hermione. Hamlet accepted the men all fulminate against women who are completely innocent. Posthumous, Othello, and Claudio fall victim to malicious plotters. Leontes suffers from self-generated delusion. What's important here is that in all of the four plays, it's the revelation of the wife's innocence that constitutes the anagnorisis that resolves the conflict. And it leads Othello to tragic realization and suicide, the others more happily to comic reunion. The plots affirm traditional gender assumptions, the idealization of female chastity. Female chastity defines female identity, and in some important sense constitutes female essence and existence. Female chastity defines male identity too. The men are husbands, not cuckolds, sole possessors in physical and legal senses of their wives. And this female chastity enables the worlds of the play to cohere and continue. But it's only Cymbeline that departs from the usual pattern in that Posthumous repents before he discovers that his wife is innocent. And this singular act of forgiveness contradicts the standard valuation of female chastity, redefines the gender relations, and overturns the ethical foundations assumed to support marriage and society. Posthumous simply dismisses the assumed adultery, reported in excruciating detail by Iachimo, with the phrase wrying but a little, and later as one of the little faults. Though he's entirely mistaken about the facts, Imogen is chaste and alive, he experiences a transformation without parallel on the early modern stage. As Anne Barton observed, there are many husbands in Renaissance drama who, like Othello, brutally kill their wives for adultery, whether falsely suspected or true, but none seeks to extenuate what still seems to him the appalling gravity of the woman's crime. Posthumous forgives, and in so doing raises important questions about the ethical imperatives in all of these plays, and particularly in this one. And this is the thing that got me going. The students were talking at dinner about Shakespeare's, where they reimagined different endings to the Shakespeare play, so that in The Merchant of Venice, for example, the pound of flesh is actually taken and Antonio dies. Okay, so in that spirit, if you were to imagine, supposing Desdemona were unfaithful, Hero were unfaithful, Paulina were Hermione were unfaithful, would the audience really have applauded the murder of the wives? I mean, how many people in the audience had experienced infidelity? And what was the right response to that? Was the response revenge, murder? Was that really the right thing to do? Well, the classical world bequeathed to Shakespeare various models of revenge for infidelity. In many versions of the Troy story, Helen's adultery, not abduction, caused the Greek fleet to sail against Troy. And these are the versions Shakespeare is likely to have known. The accounts of Dares and Dictys, Ovid, medieval Troy books, and this is an old pot showing seduction, not a rape. And of course, in Troilus and Cressida, you get a very cynical sense of that action where infidelity is the standard. The argument is a whore and a cuckold, as Thersites says. And that occasions revenge and national tragedy. And there are other classical myths too. Medea, for example, outraged at, and this is the woman of the species as deadly as the male, or even more so, where Medea kills her children because her husband Jason is unfaithful with Miola. And by the way, people who knew Maria Callas said it was not a stretch for her to play this role. This was very easy for her to do. As you can see from that imperious look, nobody's messing with her. Anyway, what's going on, and Shakespeare probably knew Medea through Seneca. It seems to play out a bit in Macbeth. But what's going on here is the revenge creates a new kind of selfhood, and Shakespeare was fascinated with this. And this is charted by precise formulations in the Latin, where Medea says, Medea super est, Medea is left, and then Maria, she says later in the action, Medea fiam, I shall become Medea, and then finally, Medea nunc sum, now I am Medea, and that's at the moment of the murders. And this is, I think, Seneca's most enduring contribution to Shakespearean and Elizabethan tragedy, is this autarkic selfhood. This is the ethics of the self that comes to fruition here. And you can remember moments in Elizabethan plays, no, I am Hieronymo in the Spanish tragedy, or tis I, tis Vindici, tis I in the Revenge's tragedy. This is I, Hamlet the Dane. And the poignant variation, that's he that was Othello. Here I am. So we have that Senecan rhythm defining that ethical imperative. And so marital infidelity is also at the heart of Thyestes, and Shakespeare knew that horrible story of the Thyestean banquet, the Atreus feeding Thyestes the remains of his children, and Shakespeare has a variation on that in Titus Andronicus. Okay, and here we have that once again, that ethics of selfhood, some greater thing larger than the common. I know not what it is, but it is some mighty thing being taken over by some great force to create a revenge, nescio quid, I know not what, something that no one knows or has seen, namely this horrid banquet, and the subsequent creation of a new self. Okay. And of course, one more classical example, you have infidelity is just one of the crimes Clytemnestra has against her husband, Atreus' son, Agamemnon, along with the sacrifice of Iphigenia. And then we have Clytemnestra being the unfaithful wife, and she is always contrasted with Penelope in the Odyssey. And we have, of course, many classical stories of Orestes' revenge on Clytemnestra. And still the most comprehensive treatment of this, I think, for Shakespeare is Gilbert Murray's 1914 British Academy lecture, where he talks about Hamlet and Orestes and how these two work out these great mythic revenge cycles. And of course, these didn't stay in classical tragedy, but they moved into the novella, those lurid tales of fiction that it seems Elizabethans couldn't get enough of. Bandello, Painter, Ser Giovanni are filled with stories of lurid revenge, many of them husbands for wives. And they stab and poison wives, force them to drink lovers' blood, to eat the hearts, all this gory stuff that you find in later Jacobean tragedy. Okay. There are also, surprisingly, maybe not, Christian traditions which also mandate punishment for infidelity, but they proceed from different assumptions and express different cultural values. The classical revenge arises from an ethic of honor, shame, fame. This is now modulated into a punishment for the violation of a divinely ordained institution. And this idea was held by Catholics and Protestants alike, and this is Catholic William Harrington on marriage, in which he talks about its importance as a sacrament and the Virgin Mary, Notre Dame, of course, entering into marriage to bring salvation to the world. And this is picked up by Protestant writers, Heinrich Bullinger, whose phrase is echoed in the homilies that were read in every Elizabethan parish, that marriage is a lawful knot, an acceptable yoking. And Bullinger believed that any violation of that bond was a wickedness grown out of the devil, idleness of flesh, and that it called for severe punishment. Okay. There was one gospel passage which both Catholics and Protestants quoted but disagreed on, and that's this one, the so-called Matean exception to the rule that a marriage could be or should be indissoluble. Whoever should put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication or adultery. For Catholics, that meant that you could separate divorciamatoro from bed and board. For many Protestants, that meant you could absolutely divorce and remarry. Okay, but that was the crucial passage, and that's one place where the two traditions are a bit different. But though they might have disagreed, every Christian condemned adultery, and many asked for severe punishments. John Calvin thought adultery sufficient not only for absolute divorce, and he wrote, the woman, notice he assumes it's the woman, but it wasn't in Geneva all the time. But the woman cuts herself off as a rotten member from her husband and sets him at liberty. He argued that infidelity caused the spiritual death of the marriage and was punishable, in fact, by death. And so the Geneva judiciary system concurred between 1561 and 66. Convictions for adultery led to the execution in Geneva of Anne Lemoyne, Antoine Cossinet, Jacques Leneveux, Bernardine Neyraud, Marie Binot, and Lois Maistre, 6 people. They were tortured, the men were decapitated, the women were drowned. Zwingli, Bucer, and Bullinger also thought death the divinely appointed punishment for adultery. Some of this rhetoric gets into this sermon where there are grisly, this was one of the sermons read, grisly punishments, mutilations, and so on that were at least mentioned. This is John Fox, and of not punishing adultery with death. And John Fox, surprisingly, well, or not, wrote, actually represents the more moderate Protestant position, where he argues that this is an extreme response to very human failing. Okay, and that's John Fox, who did the Acts and Monuments, who created, in effect, was one of the great creators of Protestant England. So it's an important voice to hear in the debate. Okay, and what about the legal practice here? The mandate for punishment normally fell on wives rather than husbands, since marriage subsumed the legal identity of the woman into the husband. Each had different rights and liabilities. Practically speaking, in England, wives rarely prosecuted husbands for infidelity, but husbands prosecuted wives. Wives more often brought husbands in for cruelty. Lawrence Stone says that husbands freely took lower-class mistresses and begot bastards. We think of Lear when Gloucester says there was good sport in his making. I'm not sure how widespread that was, but Lawrence Stone believes that is an indicative of the class. And normally the punishments were not so severe. Normally the punishment was compurgation, which meant you had to bring 4 or 5 neighbors in, you had to wear a white sheet at services for a few weeks, and you had to have in public read to you Beacon's homily. That sounds like terrible punishment to me, listening to that thing, but so it was. Interestingly, the English ecclesiastical court remained residually Catholic in the important respect it did not permit absolute divorce and remarriage, even for adultery. Okay, some of this negative, the negative ethic of punishment reached its culmination in 1650. This is actually an act that was passed, and this actually mandated the death penalty for incest and adultery in England. 3 months imprisonment for fornication, whipping, pillorying, branding, and jailing. I noticed a number of the students were sinking down in their seat when I said that 3-month thing. Anyway, similar legislation had already passed in Scotland, the colonies of Virginia, Massachusetts, rarely carried out, only 4 convictions on record. But so it is. The question is, who should do the punishing? In these acts, of course, it's the state. But there was a tradition of social custom in England and in the continent that it was up to the husband, or at least it was forgivable that the husband, who believed his wife unfaithful, could commit the delitto passionale, the crime of passion. And in fact, there are some of these treatises which actually go so far as to praise the husbands who so act. So, to sum up this tradition, the classical examples of revenge, the literary models in the novella, the ethical teaching of the Mosaic Law and Protestant Europe, the admissions of many Puritan moralists, and some legal traditions in Europe and England render intelligible the operatic wrath of Shakespearean lovers, husbands who think themselves betrayed. Such context may provide some warrant for those reactions, and Othello's self-portrait as Justice with a sword about to slay Desdemona might have struck some as defensible in principle, if not in practice. Okay. That's not the whole story, though, because there's another ethical tradition also assuming the sanctity of marriage, equally well derived from Scripture and patristics, that pushes in exactly the opposite direction. And this tradition challenges the assumptions about divorce, about gender inequality, and urges forgiveness. Cymbeline, I suggest, embodies both and features Posthumous's conversion from the first, as it were, to the second. St. Thomas Aquinas asked, is it lawful to kill an adulterous spouse? And answered resoundingly no. He said, civil courts may allow the delitto passionale, but the Church of God, quae nunquam constrigitur legibus mundanis gladium non habet nisi spiritualem, is never bound by the laws of the world, has nothing but a spiritual sword. Okay. And this is the tradition. Here's the Dante moment for Dominic. This is the tradition in Dante. You know the story of the great lovers Paolo and Francesca. Okay, and they're whirling in the winds of passion. And this is Doré's illustration, which I chose because there's another character in here, and that's the husband, Gianciotto. And it's Gianciotto who kills Paolo and Francesca. And what happens when the pilgrim meets them, remember what Francesca says. She says, Gianciotto, Caina attenda chi a vita ci spensa. Caina awaits the one who took our life. So that in the Aquinas and Dante scheme of things, there the unfaithful lovers in the whirlwinds of passion. But there, in circle 9, much worse, is the husband who dares to take it in his own hands. Okay, that's Caina. That's circle 9. It's the ice of the Inferno. St. Augustine, also responding to Pallanteus, also said, consider the example of Joseph in the Bible, another biblical passage. What did Joseph do? Her husband, being a just man and not willing to make her a public example, wanted to put her away secretly. So what was Joseph's response to Mary? He's dikaios, which was glossed frequently as just, as virtuous, and so on, and put away secretly lathrai. There's no hint of revenge here, especially striking since the Mosaic law mandated stoning for adultery. So Joseph is seen as moving in another way, a way of lenity. And this was noticed by everyone, it seems, who commented on the passage. The Geneva Bible, Hugo Grotius, Nicholas Love, Erasmus, everyone noted this moment and talked about the correct response here to this sin. So even John Milton, though John Milton used this to argue for divorce in his divorce tracts. And he believed that this made absolute divorce possible. St. Augustine, of course, thought otherwise. Augustine, in the only treatise in the first 5 centuries on this subject, says that if it's true that adultery can dissolve an indissoluble, if it's true that you can grant a divorce for adultery, then what you're really saying is that you can dissolve an indissoluble bond, a sacramental bond, simply by violating it. That's an easy out, right? But if it's indissoluble, you can't dissolve it simply by breaking it. It's just not in the nature of it. And that is a brilliant insight into that particular logical line. So Augustine said, and Augustine said what you needed to do was survive and forgive. That's what Augustine said. And so did the Council of Trent, which followed Augustine right down the line. And this was not simply Catholic, and this is one point I'd like to make, is it's just, the more you look at the writings, the more important it is to avoid simplistic binaries. Yes, it's true, Catholics and Protestants had lots of things they disagreed with. You can disagreed on. You could look at Harding, Jewell, and Bellarmine, James, and on, Parsons, Bunny, and Fox and Parsons. Yes, but beware the trap of simplistic binary we-they thinking. It's just not sensitive enough to the realities of discourse, theological and ethical discourse in the period, because this Augustinian line was picked up by many influential Protestants. And that's, I think, a crucial point. So, for example, when Augustine says, it's really not a greater sin for the woman than for the man, St. Augustine says. Why should we think that? If both are equally bound by this sacrament, why do we think boys should be boys and women are sluts if they break the bond? In fact, he argues, could it not be said that it's a greater sin on the part of the male because he is supposed to have more reason? So it's more of a violation for him. And this is not simply, this treatise is picked up in William Gouge's 1621 treatise on domestical virtues, and Augustine is quoted. This treatise is quoted right here in the Latin, that very point. And this here, which says, if God can forgive that sin, and God can forgive the sin of murder, and so on, embezzlement, whatever, who are you to withhold forgiveness? Based on what should any erring mortal withhold forgiveness from another? Okay? And so this is stated by John Dodd, who says if you can be forgiven sin, if that's what Christ is about, then that's a sin. So there's an unerring logic in this. John Dodd published this statement in 1604 to the same audiences who watched Othello stalk across the stage at the Globe and bid Desdemona to pray before killing her in a bed. So doing, Othello tragically inverted the mandated actions of penance, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Considering this scene from the Augustinian perspective, renders Othello and the other vengeful husbands mortally guilty of anger, criminally delinquent in their duties, even had all the wives been guilty. In their rage, they substitute their sinful selves for God and fail to remember the one who came as judge and savior of all sinners. So this is a contrary tradition of forgiveness on this point, and it may shed light on two perennially, and there's the Othello moment, particularly grisly. Would we really supposed to be cheering that if she had been guilty? All right, so there are two perhaps perennially puzzling Shakespearean characters. This may shed some light on the ghost of Elder Hamlet. That's, of course, Brian Blessed in the Branagh version, the wolf-eyed ghost. He's a husband who believes his wife has betrayed him, and he comes little resembling a penitent spirit from purgatory. He's demanding revenge, but he's curiously Augustinian in his response to Gertrude, portraying the supposed sin as a fall from grace into sick sensuality. Lust, though to a radiant angel linked, will sate itself in a celestial bed and prey on garbage. He commands Hamlet, leave her to heaven and to those thorns that in her bosom lodge to prick and sting her. Instead of seeking revenge, he consigns her to the stirrings of conscience, the stirrings that might yet save her, who knows. Even more dramatically, though there are other issues, of course, I think of Mariana in Measure for Measure, who protects the treacherous Angelo, former fiancé, newly married husband, from execution for his many betrayals. Oh, my most gracious Lord, I hope you will not mock me with a husband. And the good Mariana, I think, is just essential to that play, and I think she was. And then she argues, best men are molded out of faults. They become much the better for being a little bad. Well, I mean, he was way more than a little bad in that play, but she dismisses the oath-breaking, the slander, the attempted murder, the attempted rape, I mean, the whole thing, and pleads for mercy, forgiveness for marriage, her marriage. It's a powerful moment. Okay. So, if we return to our friend Posthumous now, who repents his vengeful anger at Imogen and holds up a bloody cloth, perhaps a charged marker of religious identity, signaling a profound conversion. When he oddly addresses the audience, you married ones, he says, you would murder wives much better than yourselves for Wrying but a little. Fundamentally shifts the grounds of moral culpability and judgment. Adultery is no longer the spiritual death of the marriage, the unforgivable violation, but a sin committed by a fallen human being. Posthumous is no longer the accuser, the self-righteous avenger who needs to create a new self, a transcendent self, by violent action. But he's a fellow sinner. He says, gods, if you have taken vengeance on my faults, I never had lived to put on this. I'm more guilty than she. He does not catalog his own faults here, but he recognizes the depths of his depravity. And Sarah Beckwith observes that this shows us the contours of a remorse that is vital to the extraordinary last scene. He goes on to imagine his wife's repentance and talks about the injustice of allowing her to die and the possibility of salvation. Posthumous regrets that the sinner did not have a chance to repent, but that he, a greater sinner, will have a chance, that she is snatched hence and now in heaven. It's a complicated meditation. I submit it arises from that second ethical tradition, its root belief in the reality of the fall for everyone, in the necessity of penance and forgiveness, and in the possibility of redemption. And it also is a repudiation of that earlier tradition of vengeance, now left to the gods, not to himself. And this contradicts the reasoning that governs the other plays about sexual infidelity, domestic tragedies, the revenge plays. Okay? So then Posthumous goes on to practice obedience and humility, and so he disguises himself again as a Briton, which of course he is, but he's in a disguise that is sufficient to efface his identity, not to assert it. And then he takes the effacement a step further when he switches back to be a Roman and seeks death, self-abnegation. My conscience thou art fettered more than my shanks and wrists. You good gods, give me the penitent instrument to pick that bolt, then free forever. For Imogen's dear life, Posthumous says, take mine. So this language is deeply theological, deeply reflective of the debates on satisfaction and on penitence there. But it's important to note that she is not really dead to him, but alive. She is the spiritual presence that governs his life. And this is not Roman suicide he wants. This is something different. And what's going on here, I think the best gloss on this comes from another play. It's Much Ado. And that's him in this moment, Michael Pennington, his moment of self-abnegation, his wish for death. And this is the friar in Much Ado. It's his plan. He says, Claudio has repudiated Hero. When he shall hear she died upon his words, the idea of her life shall sweetly creep into his study of imagination, and every lovely organ of her life shall come apparelled in more precious habit, more moving, delicate, and full of life into the eye and prospect of his soul than when she lived indeed. Then shall he mourn, if ever love had interest in his liver, and wish he had not so accused her. No, though he thought his accusation true. Well, that plan fails spectacularly in Much Ado. Claudio sneeringly recalls Leonato and Antonio's challenge. Oh, those old men without teeth. He wants to be jested out of his high-proof melancholy. What can you say about Claudio? Fortunately, we don't have to, because we're talking about Posthumous here. And Posthumous really does act this out. The idea of Imogen creeps into his imagination. She is alive. He grieves for her. He speaks to her in death. Everything is rendered irrelevant, forgotten, forgiven by the power of authentic marital love. This is a power that in this play has divine rather than human origins, and is part of a larger series of presencings, forgivenesses, and reconciliations. This is Sarah Beckwith's phrase again. The curiously resonant lines of Anagnorisis hang there like fruit, my soul, till the tree die. When they finally come together, Posthumous and Imogen draw upon traditional emblems of the vine and elm as representing marriage or friendship until death. Okay. The remarkable thing about this play is the reading of it. It's very easy to make fun of, and many people have made fun of it, but it's very different in the theater. It can be very moving in the theater. And the moment when these two come together, I saw at the American Shakespeare Center, I saw this production, and you know, it's not filled with Shakespeareans, it's just filled with audiences, and there was not a dry eye in the house. These kids were just totally moving when they got together again. Very beautiful. And that's Michael Pennington and Helen Mirren. And here we have Graham Abbey and Kara Ricketts, The Embrace. Remarkably satisfying intensity. Can't explain it, but it worked. And then that parses out a whole grammar of forgiveness that extends to everyone. Imogen forgiving Posthumous, let's not forget that, for the wager, for the attempted murder. Cymbeline forgiving Belarius for the kidnapping of his sons. Guiderius is forgiven for slaying Cloten. Rome is forgiven for demanding tribute. Posthumous even forgives Iachimo. So. And just to conclude, to appreciate this vision, all we have to do is consider some later versions of the play. Thomas Durfee's long-running adaptation, The Injured Princess. He, or Saches, comes out and wants to, at the end of the play, sees his wife amidst the shades of hell. Okay, slays the villainous deceiver, tries to commit suicide. So that's the arc, the spiritual arc of that play. William Hawkins, 1759, another version of this play. He manages at the end of the play not only to be angry with his wife, but also his mother and all women. So he's back in the traditional misogyny and never leaves it. And of course, the most famous George Bernard Shaw's Cymbeline refinished. That's not Shaw, of course. That's Ellen Terry. Shaw thought that this was a terrible play and a bad ending, and believed that Imogen should say at the end of the play, rather than those beautiful embraces, well, I must go home and make the best of it, as other women must. Stuck with this clown for a husband. This resignation is apparently what he had in mind when he advised Ellen Terry, playing Imogen, to leave the paragon out and put the woman in. By all accounts, she triumphantly ignored him. So, just to conclude, I think I would just want to leave you with three thoughts. One is that Shakespeare was marvelously attuned to these ethical traditions and marvelously attuned to the deep traditions on both sides of the aisle, and thought long and hard about them and translated them into very moving theater. Second is, just to repeat, it's true there are big differences between Catholics and Protestants, but it's a mistake to use those differences to beat up the other side. That binary oppositional thinking is not very helpful, and it's not very true to the traditions, as you can see. And lastly, I'd say that Cymbeline is an extraordinary play, extraordinary moving play, and it's one of those plays that moves us into those last plays of Shakespeare where forgiveness is so powerfully present. But perhaps its power is best appreciated in the theater, not in a lecture, certainly. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and it has, in an instant, shifted my thinking on the play. I mean, you have made me think about this play in a different way. But I wonder about one. You talked about the moving sort of body language at the very end of the play, and there's one gesture that really stands out when Posthumous strikes Imogen. And that's always been a bit of a stumbling block for me. And I wonder how that fits with the idea of him having undergone a sort of conversion.
Well, it's her at that point. I mean,
well, right, but it's still an indication of a propensity for violence and a kind of irascible, it's not someone who's...
Yeah, well, I'm very happy he doesn't turn into Francis Assisi at the end. But, I mean, I think the human anger at Iachimo, and it's a shove. In the productions I've seen, it's a shove, I suppose. I think in a source, it's much more violent. I certainly see the point. There is the eruption of the military moment, which of course is part of the complexity of the whole fifth act, where he's this force of nature on the battlefield also. So it'd be too easy to say that he turns into a self-abnegating, perhaps I left that erroneous impression, self-abnegating, humble, saintly, forgiving, penitential fellow. That's too easy. There are moments of rage, and he has rage at Iachimo, but he masters it. And it's the mastering that, it's the battle. One of the students was telling me the Purgatory is his favorite canticle, and it's mine too, because it's, the Paradiso is for the saints, but the Purgatory is for the sinners. So that's.
Does Shakespeare deal widely with forgiveness in his other plays?
Yeah, big topic, as I was saying, certainly the last plays, Prospero, The Tempest, which I'm sure you'll read, I hope you'll see, and where he lets go of the anger. I mean, he claims at one point that one thing he wants is repentance from those who have injured him. He really doesn't get it, but he lets it go.
I remember Anthony and Cleopatra, Caesar forgives Anthony because his wife and brother made war on Caesar, and he forgave him.
Not to mention the principles forgiving each other through Antony and Cleopatra forgiving each other throughout the play. Yeah. And as you say, in the Roman plays, you have a whole different set of ethics going on. But certainly those last plays of Shakespeare, that's pretty haunting for me. Yes.
Thank you for a really great talk. I wondered if you could talk, since you were speaking a little bit about Othello and his revenge. If you could talk a little bit about Desdemona at the end when she comes back, seemingly from death, and when Amelia says, "Who's done this?" and she says, "Nobody but myself." And then Othello seems to miss. If that's an act of forgiveness, he seems to miss it. But if you could talk about that a little bit more, because that's also forgiveness when she doesn't know anything about Othello's being deceived. She just knows that he's murdered her.
Astonishing. And, the worst article I ever read, I think, and that's going somewhere, was somebody detailed explanation of how an implant can be broken and someone still speaks. But the best comment on the scene, I think, is Verdi's opera, in which he intuits and gathers from the beginning that there's this, he has her sing this aria to Maria, and he has Iago do the credo, which is his enunciation of evil, his evil dogma, his evil deed. So the absolute saintliness, which is not really what I think Desdemona is or should be, but there's that part of her that's accessible, and that certainly appears in that moment. And Shakespeare is very clear to put the vocabulary of angels and devils and hell and heaven in his plays. And this is an example of that access to a higher, pure self. It's not the whole story, but it's there. It's part of the fabric that moves us, and why we mourn for it. I mean, who's capable of that? You'd be with Amelia, you dolt, you go. Yeah.
So I've been pondering recently Measure for Measure a bit in my spare time. And
and there's so much of it.
There's so much spare time. And of course, you end up with a lot of mercy-justice dichotomy. But now I'm thinking of it in the context of your talk. It seems that it's also almost a forgiveness-justice dichotomy. Almost as if when when Angelo is forgiven at the end, we're no longer giving measure for measure. He's not dealt what has been dealt to him. So is there, do you see any tension with forgiveness and justice? Is there some kind of overturning of the justice system by forgiving? When the unfaithful wife is forgiven, then does that threaten justice? That's also
Yes, and aren't we glad it does? And who should escape whipping? Really, but that moment. I said,
speak to us?
yes,
Well,
aren't we glad it does? Who should escape whipping if mercy didn't temper justice? But that moment, Mariana's moment, is not the most extraordinary moment of forgiveness. I mean, maybe it is, but certainly it's Isabella's moment when she takes the part, and of course a good production, I think, has her wait before she kneels and says, you know, my brother partly had what he deserved, but a good production will make that an agonizing way, because that is the struggle to overcome the vengeful self for some other thing. I think that is a play about how hard it is to be good in a fallen world, and a play that deeply engages those things. And on the matter of justice, it raises another question: what is justice in a world where the law is so hard to figure out? I mean, what is justice? I mean, justice is which lawyer wins the case. And that's the world of measure for measure, really in a gritty, very realistic world where the law is manipulated. I mean, not the houses in the city go down, but not those in the suburbs. So the selective, and of course the scenes with Elbow are all about how impossible it is. Is it a dish of prunes, or what is it that they're arguing about? It's impossible to know sometimes. I mean, justice it's hard to figure out. Just as it's hard to figure out what's virtue and what's vice in that play sometimes. Don't we know Angela's?
All right, after no more questions.
Thank you very
again,
much.
Professor
Thanks for
Miola.
coming out.